Now we're going to start the Q&A with a little bit of a poll, and I think that we're going to go back to more or less where we started with the first lecture and address a little bit of things regarding Stephen's topic. And I think this is perhaps an interesting question, Stephen, that we could ask the audience, just to see more or less where they're at. And now you need to, of course, use the voting feature, so I need more votes. Yeah. Okay, so people are a little bit convinced, I think, right? Could
Yeah,
you,
that looks good.
Rather good, right?
You know, some people are going to still look at insertion torque as an important figure. If it's the only figure that you're using, it's better than using no figures. But I think that the idea of having a non-destructive assessment using what Osstell can show us is so much more predictable and so much better towards the long-term survival of that implant that it just makes sense to me to go in that direction.
You mentioned in the study that you performed in your centers, these cases, 441 cases, if I don't remember it correctly. And we have a question here regarding as to that you are looking at the ISQ rather than perhaps the torque. As to what's the point of ISQ if you carefully selected the cases. Could you elaborate a little bit about this?
Well, they're making an assumption that our cases are carefully selected.
Yeah.
We see patients who come through the front door of the office. And these patients sometimes have great bone. Sometimes these patients have just incredibly poor bone. These are not hand-selected, pre-selected. We haven't hidden another group of patients that didn't meet some odd set of criteria. This is 441 patients who came through the doors in that 16-month time frame. The point of the ISQ is, well, the first point was a research point. Are we making the implant stability better by securing the implants with the prosthesis? And the answer to that, I think, is a pretty resounding yes. The next question becomes, how do we assess the time of healing? Dentists, we tend to be one-size-fits-all folks. You know, we have one trick in our bag, and then we keep using that until we get another bag of tricks, and that bag will have one trick in it. What ISQ does is it gives us a real description of when you can heal, or when an independent implant is healed to the point that you can restore it definitively. And I think that's a pretty great thing to know.
And on that regard, you know, because obviously if you treat patients like you do with immediate loading and you apply abutments, perhaps when you do the temporary restoration, at second stage when you're sort of deciding on when to load the case permanently or definitive, how do you measure implant stability?
Yeah,
with ISQ?
We've worked with Osstell, and they've developed specific smart pegs for us in our office that allow us to remove the prosthetic screw. So if you have a prosthesis in place, it's held in by 4 implants. Each of the 4 joints are basically holding the prosthesis into place, but they're also holding the implant and preventing it from rotating. So if I take the screw out of those implant or prosthetic screws out, one by one, remove a screw, you have a small suction head smaller than the diameter of the screw, hopefully. Suctions the screw out of the access, put the smart peg in, check the ISQ values, take that smart peg back, put the prosthetic screw in, and do that sequentially around the arch. You've created no additional torque on those implants. You haven't altered their setting, but you have been able to find out exactly how much improvement in ISQ value there is across the board to determine whether or not that's time to do your final restoration.
So we should mention that it's not sort of commercially available at the moment, but it's obviously very intriguing that we could measure ISQ both on abutment and fixture level.
Yeah, and obviously it's something that that the folks at Osstell are going, can already recognize that there's value in doing this, and I'm sure when there's value in doing something, there's value in making it available to the public.
Yeah. Another interesting question is because, I mean, you have a very long experience within the field of dental implantology, and looking into the future perhaps, do you think that we could affect, the level of ISQ by tweaking any more things about the implants, Because you've seen multiple generations of implants. Is that, in your head?
10 years from now, if we're doing the exact same things that we're doing today, we've lost the battle. Everything is in a constant state of evolution until a revolutionary idea comes along. And then the revolutionary idea throws everything into a state of cognitive disarray until we get a handle on that, and then we go back to evolution.
Yeah. Of course, obviously you do a lot of immediate loading, and I would like to switch a little bit to that, because now if we're talking about the specific implant, you mentioned something there, Luis, with the implants you're using, etc. And when you're using demanding situations, where you're using immediate loading in different situations, could you explain a little bit about your ideas about if it's single, partially, or fully dentulous patients, what ISQ level would be comfortable for you in your opinion?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think I feel comfortable. I don't know you, but I feel comfortable when I reach 65. I will say that. In most of the cases, it depends on the clinical situation, of course. If you are making a single unit, a full arch, you are splinting, the way you are doing. But I will say that from a clinical point of view, without entering in any other thing, I will say that 65 to 70 will be a nice figures, But sometimes we are doing with 65, and sometimes we are doing with 80, So I think it's a mix of the clinical situation, the ISQ value, and your personal impression according to your clinical experience. But 65 will be a suggestion. Yeah.
Okay. And there was another question focusing a little bit about this value, because what I saw is that you reached quite high values. So this was one of the questions. If you're afraid of having a too high value?
No.
So there's no really reason to
not in my experience. I don't know yours, but not in my experience. No.
What do you say, the other speakers?
In terms of ISQ, going back to the value that make me feel comfortable, it really depends, first of all, on the surgical site. If I did augmentation, I don't feel 100% comfortable in doing, for example, medial loading. If I have like 64, 69, I will wait a little bit longer. I feel comfortable in previously augmented sites if I have more than 70 to go for medial loading. Otherwise, I totally agree with Luis. 64 to 66, Peter Moy published on this also, is the threshold to move on, actually.
And going back to what you said in your lecture, because you saw some differences, as you mentioned in your cases. So let's see if we can ask the audience a little bit. In terms of ISQ, does it reveal in general a different pattern in those grafted sites compared to native bone? Similar or higher ISQ values in grafted sites? So let's start voting.
The holes are open.
Let's see if we can reactivate it. Okay, and here we see. Okay, so the majority of people think that it's high ISQ values. So would you sort of...
Yeah, actually, that's a little tricky, these questions, because it depends. I mean, the type of bone quality that we get after guided bone regeneration, that's based on my experience.
Yeah.
It really depends on the donor sites. If we harvest 100% autologous bone, for example, they can be comparable, native bone versus augmented sites. If we do mix autologous bone harvest from very dense bone, which is ascending ramus, tori, for example, or exostosis, and then we mix it with xenograft, bovine xenograft, that bone is denser. If we mix the same bone with porcine bone, for example, it is softer. So it's difficult to just give one single answer because it depends the type of technique they use for guided bone regeneration. But if we do it how we do it today, cortical autologous bone, chips, 50% mixed with 50% of xenograft, bovine xenograft. Then based on my experience, I always had higher SQ value all the time.
Yeah, there were actually several questions on this push from the audience as to what is the biological reason behind it. Why do you reach a high ISQ value? So that's, as you say, that's the...
I think it's based on bone density. There is a positive correlation between bone density and ISQ values. So it's based on the bone. That's why if I use, as we were doing in the past, 100% autologous bone, when we were doing guided bone regeneration, we didn't see the difference between that bone and the native bone. But if the bone was harvested from cortical sites, that bone was harder compared to native bone. So what I'm saying, for example, if we use like a block, maybe that's easier to understand. If we harvest the block from the chin, where we have type 2 bone, spongious and collagen, spongious and cortical, sorry, then that block tends to maintain its own vitality. And when we place the implants, we can feel that bone density. When we harvest the block, for example, from the ascending ramus, where we have a veneers of 100% type 1 bone, so very cortical, it behaves in a completely different way. So ISQ is definitely related to the bone density. That's my experience with Osstell. So we cannot generalize. It would be too, we can't simplify that much.
Going back to the actual value of the ISQ, a little bit, the reason behind it. And perhaps this is a question for you, Stephen. What is it it's actually showing? To explain that a little bit again. Does it show us the micromotion of implants or the whole system, bone plus implant?
But for me?
Yes.
Okay. ISQ is showing you this resonance in response to stimulation. So you stimulate the implant in one way or another, and it's going to cause some response in the bone. It's not reaching the level of micromotion that maximizes micromotion between the implant and the bone. So it's not measuring 29 micrometers of motion. It's measuring this resonance frequency that the more stiffness there is in the system, the higher the number it becomes. It's not a micromotion specifically.
No, specifically around the values, because there are, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are many questions from clinicians as to what value should I trust? And there are some questions coming in here specifically addressed to that. And here's one. When there's a high discrepancy between the different readings, because you take several readings, would you take the average of those two readings? What would be your approach clinically?
No, I wouldn't take the average. I would like to have anyway the lowest value above 64, 65 anyway, to feel that self-confidence. So I wouldn't do the value. Of course, it depends also on the residual bone. So generally, mesiodistally, it tends to measure a little bit higher in general, because you have larger volume of bone. In the buccolingual dimension, it depends if you have this buccal bone buccoling or not.
Yeah.
no, I wouldn't do anyway any kind of average between the two readings. I want to have both above that level to make me feel confident.
I think you have to mix your ISQ values with the clinical situation. If you have noticed there is no bone on mesial, or I think you have to look for explanation and take the best decision according to your ISQ values and your clinical impression. Yeah.
Another question focusing on that. Let's say you do a very extensive treatment, and as you mentioned a little bit, George, at second stage, you feel very comfortable and confident of getting the readings right before.
Yeah,
let's say you have reason to believe that it's a failure, and here's one. What is the ISQ that you require to remove the implant? Meaning that you have a failure.
At second stage surgery, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, if I get a measurement that doesn't make me feel comfortable, I'm gonna wait more. I'm gonna give the chance to the tissue to heal longer. Sometimes it's the good advantage of Osstell is that it's dynamic measurement. So why should I take out the implant immediately? Sometimes we have patients that need, for example, the case I show on the canine, we had to wait a little bit longer. Not all the surgical sites are the same. And I would measure it. Of course, I would wait at least 1 month, 1.5 months from one reading to another one.
Between the readings.
Yes.
I think that it's the trend that you're looking at.
Exactly.
If you have a number of 70 and you come back 6 weeks later and that number is dropped to 55, that's a pretty bad sign at 6 weeks. At 2 weeks, that number wouldn't bother me because you're in that dip phase. Yeah. But if, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, if that number has dipped and isn't coming back, it isn't coming back.
Luis, what's your opinion?
Yeah, same. Thank you.
Yeah, so you agree?
Saying that, Giorgio.
Another interesting question. There were some questions around this, and I think maybe we should enforce this just a little bit as to the length of the implant, if that correlates to any type of ISQ value. And let's see if what you heard in these lectures and vote. And perhaps I would like, George, you to a little bit elaborate on this. There seems to be a push against, well, similar. Or it's more towards yes. So what's the right answer?
Okay, based on my experience, based on the literature also, there is a positive correlation between the length of the implant and the ISQ values. But based on an article published by Senerby, Fuhr and Merritt, I think a while ago, if you increase the length of the implant, doesn't necessarily you get higher ISQ value all the time. So basically the highest that you can get based on that article is between 11 and 13 millimeters. If you go beyond that, not necessarily you're going to get higher ISQ value. So yeah, there is a positive correlation.
Okay. What's your opinion, Stephen?
Yeah, I think that's right, that there comes a practical limit. You're not going to put in a zygomatic implant and expect that because it's so long that you're going to get a huge ISQ value. There's a point of diminishing returns.
And for you, Luis, when you're immediate loading products, are you looking for longer implants, or that's not the case?
Our philosophy is to place the longer and wider implant we can place. But it's just for a personal feeling, it's a clinical point of view. So I think it's more a technical question for the Osstell side, but because I never take place one and make comparison, make placing a longer one, in same patients, but don't know. Yeah, I fully agree with my colleagues,
Yeah.
But I would like to have the opportunity to know the opinion from Osstell regarding that.
And obviously, of course, if you take a lot of measurements, you do extensive treatments and treat many patients as you do in your offices. I mean, obviously, I see a lot of positive attributes of uploading that data so that I can learn from it and other people can learn from it. And going back to that, the portal, Osstell Connect, how do you see the clinical benefits? I mean, if people start doing this.
Me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, for us it's mandatory because we need to compare in the long term and to share all that information to get scientific knowledge of what we are doing. So the ability to share all that information and to keep it for us to review and everything, it's really important. I think so.
You know, we've introduced the concept of evidence-based dentistry. And if you look at most dentists and say, well, how many implants did you do last year? And how many of those succeeded? And the first word out of their mouth is about. No, I don't really care about. I want to know how many. And clinicians have to know their own experiences and their own data before they ever think about making a change. You know, if a new this or that comes along and I decide, well, I have to use it because the guy down the street's using it, it could be totally irrelevant. I could watch my success rate drop by 5%, especially if I don't know what my success rate is. So in evidence-based dentistry, the concept is to use the best available evidence, and the best available evidence for the three of us is not what I have or what you have or you have. It's what I have for me, not what you have for you. So you have to know the information, and then when you own information, you look to this other source of information, because I think it will be truly valuable at that point.
Well, I think the microphone doesn't work anymore, but I like it a lot, actually, because I personally don't like writing the charts and having something's already there, you know, after the measurements, and on the iCloud that can be online. It's easier and faster and can be checked all the time from different devices. So it's very practical. I see it's very practical. I would love to have a system that can be customized, for example, because I would like to add extra features, for example, in terms of tissue regeneration, for example. But then the other point I think it's very important is it should be defined also the level of expertise, because overall you have some statistics. But then one thing, if you know the surgery is done by a general dentist, another thing would be if the implant is placed by a periodontist or a prosthodontist, so things can change. So I think the level of expertise also should be emphasized in this system rather than putting all this data together.
And then we're approaching the end, and I would like you to look now into the future. I mean, Osstell has just been launched, the Connect part. What do you see perhaps as the next step in development of the Osstell and the technique?
Where to talk with engineers. Well, I will.
What would you like to see?
What I would like to see. I would like to know more about Osstell and bone regeneration, bone stabilization. I would like to have a sort of tools. We discussed with Stefan. I asked him to give us this gift for one of the next Christmas holidays, to check the healing also of the surrounding bony structure. I think that's future, is not real, but yeah.
Steven?
Sure. Is this working?
Yeah.
You know, I think that we need to do more than just look at the implant. Looking at prosthetic stability, if we can use resonance frequency to see about resonance in this direction, a buccal lingual or mesial distal direction relative to a vertically placed implant, we can also look at the micromotion in the interface between a prosthesis and the implant. So we can check or qualify how well our prostheses fit. It's just a new thought of what you can do with this sort of device, but I think it definitely is a thought that needs to be made.
Luis?
I know that Osstell is coming with new developments, so I think most of my expectations are covered because you mentioned, you also, Giorgio. I don't know, maybe the integration with the simple integration with technology, for example, with the software of guided. We were talking yesterday about the bone density and the ability to measure the density of the bone with your Osstell. I don't know, maybe some things that make us clinicians our life better and simpler.
Okay. Sounds very good, and with that, I think we're approaching the end. And as a moderator, I would first like to, on behalf of the Osstell company, the EA organization, and of course our great speakers here, thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you.
And I would also like to say that we hope that you have a great stay here in Madrid, but also that you make sure that you don't miss the next year's symposium celebrating 10 years of the Osstell Scientific Symposium in beautiful city of Vienna. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for all the speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.